There is a jar being made this morning, in a pottery yard on the dry side of a hill, and nobody would stop to watch. The potter has been at it since before light. He works the clay in coils, laying one wet rope of it on top of the last, walking around the piece as it grows, closing the seams with the heel of his hand. The clay is grey and cold and smells like a riverbank. By the middle of the morning the thing stands as high as his shoulder, wide at the belly, narrow at the mouth, heavy enough that it will take 2 men to move it, and it will never be moved again once it goes into the floor. Near the rim, where he steadied it, his thumb has left a small dent in the wet clay. He leaves it. Fired clay keeps whatever touched it while it was soft. Then the jar goes into the kiln, and the fire does the only thing that turns a riverbank into stone. That fire does not belong to the potter. It does not belong to his village or his country or to anybody alive. It was stolen, once, out of a workshop on a mountain, by someone who knew exactly what it was going to cost him. Every flame burning anywhere on the face of the earth this morning came down from that one theft. This jar will stand in a storeroom, in a house, at the edge of a plain. A woman will put her hand on the lid and lift it, and for the next 3,000 years, people who never met her will say her name and mean the word blame. She does not exist yet. Nobody has thought of her. There is no name to say, because nobody has chosen one. On the morning this jar comes out of the kiln, the order to build her has not been given. It is about to be. It was noticed at night, and it was noticed by accident. A god was crossing home late over the eastern plains, high up, at the hour when there is nothing down there worth looking at, and something caught his eye and made him look again. The floor of the world had been black for a long time. That was how it was now. You flew over it the way you fly over open water, with nothing underneath to hold your attention. That night the black was not all black. There was a point of orange down there, small as a pinprick, steady, sitting in the middle of the dark plain, like a coal in an ash bed. He circled once, looked again, then he went on home, because it was late, and because one light on the ground is not the kind of thing you wake a king about. By the end of that week there were 9 of them. The counting started before anybody knew what they were counting. On Olympus the whole business took some days to work its way up through the proper channels, the way news moves through any large house, one servant to another, a remark at a doorway, somebody mentioning it to somebody who mentions it to somebody else. There are lights down there, several. They come out after dark, and they are gone by morning, and they are not lightning, and they are not stars. And a king who had personally taken every fire out of the world was told, in his own hall, that the world had fires in it. They searched the forge first, because there was nowhere else to search. The workshop of Hephaestus was cut into the flank of the mountain below the high halls, a long cavern of orange light, where the great fires were never all the way out. Even banked for the night, the place breathed heat. Racks of hammers, bins of ore, a floor swept clean, because the craftsmen liked it clean. They went through it the way you go through a room where something has been taken. They raked out the hearths and spread the coals and counted them, which is work for somebody who has never once had to think about what a coal is. They checked the doors. The doors were fine. They looked for a broken latch, and there was no latch, because there had never been one. Nobody guards fire on that mountain. Guarding it had never crossed an immortal mind, because theft is a crime of people who need things, and nothing up there had ever needed anything. Nothing was missing. That was the finding. Every one of the great fires was exactly where it had been, burning, undisturbed, complete. What had been taken was the size of an acorn. You could hold it in the hollow of your hand. You could lay it in a bed of dry pith inside a hollow stalk and close a flap of bark over it and walk out through the front door with the thing riding warm against your palm. And every eye in creation could watch you go, and none of them would see one thing wrong. There was no hole in the wall, because a hole in the wall was never necessary. The greatest theft in the history of the sky left the room tidier than it found it. And when the question came around to who, the answer was already standing in the room with them. The thief had been a guest. He had walked in through a door he was welcome at. He had stood in that workshop 100 times on honest business. In the good years, when he was the counselor of the crown, and the one Titan who had crossed over, and the mind everybody in the new order lined up to borrow. He knew where the great hearth was. He knew where the coals sat hottest under the ash. He had not broken into anywhere, because there was nowhere he was not already allowed to be. The craftsman had to hear this in his own workshop, standing among his own cold tools, while other people went through his coals. His name was Prometheus, and the king had a file on him. Here is what was in it, and it can be short, because it happened long before this morning, and it has been chewed over enough. There had been a meeting once, on a plain called Mekone, to settle the terms between heaven and the creatures on the ground. What belongs to the sky? What stays below? Ordinary business. The kind of thing you decide once, and then it runs for 1,000 years. There was an ox, and they gave Prometheus the knife, because both sides trusted him, and he cut the animal into 2 portions and let the king choose first. One portion was ugly, grey, wet, wrapped up in the stomach lining, the sort of thing you step around in a butcher yard. The other one gleamed. It was dressed in white fat, layer on layer, sculpted, and in that old world fat was the glory of a feast. And it sat there in the grass, looking like everything good. The king reached out with both hands, in front of the assembled world, and took the beautiful one. The fat came away, and underneath it there was nothing but bones, clean, white, bare, not a mouthful of food in the whole stack. The meat was inside the ugly bag, and the ugly bag was going home with the creatures on the ground, and it was going home with them forever, because the terms had been agreed to out loud by everybody present. Whether the king saw the trick coming and stepped into it anyway, or whether he was taken in like anybody else and only understood it when his hands were already full of bones, the oldest account cannot decide, and neither will I. Both versions sit in the same poem, a few lines apart, and every teller since has walked past that contradiction without touching it. What matters for this morning is the file. There was a grievance in it, and it was not settled, and it had been sitting there getting older. So, when the fire went out of the world, it was not a burst of temper. It was a second entry in an open account, and it was done quietly. Nobody heard a decree. Nobody saw a hand come out of the clouds. There was simply an evening when a woman knelt at her hearth with her fire drill and her dry moss and did everything her mother taught her, and spun until her palms burned, and nothing happened. Then the same thing in the next house. Then the same thing in the next valley. The fires already burning became the most guarded objects on earth for a while. People fed them and banked them and watched over them like a sick relative. But fires go out. One went out in the rain. One went out because a door stood open in the night. One went out because a child was tired and forgot. No new fire could be born to take its place. So the map went dark by degrees, house by house, valley by valley, until you could fly the whole floor of the world at midnight and see nothing at all. That was the state of things. That had been the state of things for a long time, which is why one orange pinprick on a black plane was worth circling twice. After that, the king began watching himself, not through anybody, in person. He would come out at the edge of the high air, after dark, where the mountain drops away into nothing and the whole eastern country lies open below like a floor, and he would stand there and look down and count. The first nights were easy. 9, then 14. He knew where they were. He could have told you which valley each one sat in, and there was an order to it that made the thing seem manageable. Then it was 50, and they were no longer scattered at random. They had begun to string themselves along the rivers, because that is where people live, and the strings made shapes, and the shapes could be read. Then it was too many to count in one sweep, and he counted them in sections, the way you count a herd. The eastern flats, the country under the hills, the long valley in the north that had been empty for as long as there had been a north. Whatever else that king was, he was not slow, and the arithmetic in front of him was not complicated. Every one of those lights was a hearth. Every hearth could light another hearth. A man carries a burning branch across a field to his neighbor's door, and now there are 2, and it costs him nothing, and he loses nothing by doing it. And there is no version of the world where he refuses. Fire is the only kind of property that doubles when you give it away. He had taken an element out of the world by owning it. But ownership is a thing you exercise once, at the source. When the source is loose and dividing every night in 10,000 human hands, there is no source anymore. There is only weather. He could burn a village any evening he liked, and in the morning the people from the next village would come across the fields with a coal in a clay pot and set that village going again. And they would do it without being asked, and they would think of it as the ordinary decency of neighbors. He could send the water. That option existed, and he would use it eventually, and that is a different night. But water is what you use at the end, when you are finished with a thing. And he was not finished. He had built the whole arrangement of the world after the war, and he had built it carefully, and those creatures were part of the arrangement. So the king stood at the edge of the high air, night after night, over a plain that had been black and was not black anymore, and ran the numbers all the way down. You cannot take back a gift that is already living in the hands of the people who received it, but you can reach the hands. He did nothing for a long while, and the nothing was the most dangerous thing he ever did. Whichever version of that king you carry out of Makoni, the one who was fooled or the one who let himself be fooled, because a public wrong is worth more than an ox. Neither version forgets and neither version hurries. The lights spread up the valleys and out along the coast. He watched them spread. Whole seasons went by in the high air with the account open and no entry made against it. The obvious answers came and went. It is worth walking through them the way he did, because the shape of the plan comes out of what he threw away. Something like a storm was tried. Somewhere. The old tellers do not stage it, but you can read it backward out of what happened next. And what happened next was that the people came back. That is the trouble with hitting a house. A house has neighbors. Knock one down in the night, and in the morning there are 8 people standing in your rubble with a pot of live coals. And by evening the roof is half on, and there is smoke coming out of it again. Those creatures had learned to carry fire, and in learning it, they had learned to carry each other. Disease had no road into them yet, not the way it would later. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter enormously, and it is going to matter soon. A monster was pointless. A monster is a thing you can see, and anything they can see, they will eventually kill. They were already killing animals far above their weight with nothing but sharpened wood and a ring of light. And it was getting easier every generation. And every generation they were passing down what worked. And there was one more problem with all of it. The largest one. And it had a name. The creatures had a counselor now. Not a god watching over them in the pleasant sense. An actual mind. The best one in existence. Pointed permanently at their survival. Send weather, and he reads the color of the river 2 days out, and the herds are moved before the water rises. Send a hard winter, and the grain is already jarred. Because he taught them the stars, and the stars keep a calendar that does not lie. Every blow the sky could swing at those creatures, that mind would see coming from a long way off, and it would name the day, and it would tell them what to build. Anything that could be seen coming was already useless. That is the corner the king reasoned himself into, standing over a plain full of lights. And that is where the plan turned, because there is one thing forethought cannot see. A river can be read. A season can be read. A storm announces itself in the color of the sky 2 days out. But a person who does not exist yet has no river to read. There is no weather in front of her. There is nothing upstream, because she has no upstream. She is not the consequence of anything that has already happened, and consequences were the whole of what that mind could follow. Build a thing that has never been in the world before, and even Prometheus is looking at a blank space in the road. Then there is the second half of it, and the second half is colder than the first. Everything the sky had ever sent down had to go in by force. Storms break a door. Water takes the roof off. Whatever comes down like that gets met. The way people meet a thing that comes down like that, which is with their backs against a wall and their neighbors coming across the field. A house has another way in. People open the door themselves. All the time. Every day. They open it because somebody is standing on the step and the somebody looks cold, or lost, or lovely, or simply because it is morning and a knock came. The door is not a weak point in a human house. The door is the whole design. Those creatures had survived down there by letting each other in, and the letting in was the reason they were still alive. And you could not train it out of them without killing the thing that made them worth punishing in the first place. So the answer would not arrive as a hardship. It would arrive as a good thing. It would arrive as the best thing anybody in that country had ever seen, standing on a doorstep. And it would be carried through the door on the arms of the man who lived there. Gladly, gratefully, with his own 2 hands. And nobody would be able to warn them, because a warning has to be about something, and this was going to be about nobody. It would have no history. It would carry no smell of weather. It would have a face that had never been in the world, and a voice nobody had ever heard, and a name that had not been chosen. The order went down to the workshop. The room was the same room, same cavern in the flank of the mountain, same banked fires breathing orange under their ash, same racks of hammers, same swept floor. This was the room the ember had been carried out of. Whether the king picked it for that reason nobody wrote down, and nobody needed to. There is a kind of mind that answers a theft from a room by ordering the counterstroke built in the same room. And by now, you have met that mind. The craftsman read the order twice. He had made the gates of heaven. He had made armor that turned the weapons of gods. He had made tables of gold that rolled themselves to the feast and rolled themselves home again, and serving women out of metal who moved and worked beside him and had understanding in them. There was nothing anybody had ever asked him for that he could not make better than the asking. Nobody had ever asked him for this. Make a person. The materials were listed at the bottom of the order, and that was where he stopped. He read the list again. Then he set the order down on the bench and stood looking at nothing for a while, which was not like him. Earth, water, that was all of it. 2 words, and neither one had any business in that workshop. There was gold in bins along the wall, rough and unworked, more of it than any mortal king would see in a lifetime. Silver, bronze in ingots stacked like bricks, ivory, metals in the deep bins at the back that have no names anymore, because the only person who ever worked them stopped a long time ago. Every one of those materials had a single property in common, and the property was the reason they were in the room. They lasted. That was the whole art. A god does not make things that end. The serving women he had built out of gold were walking around that workshop while he stood there reading, and they had been walking around it since before the war. and they would still be walking around it after every mountain in the picture had worn down to a hill. When Hephaestus made a thing, the permanence was not something he added at the finish. It was the floor the entire craft stood on. Earth and water build nothing that lasts. Earth and water are what riverbanks are made of. It is the stuff a village potter has under his fingernails. Hold a fistful of it in a closed hand, and open the hand an hour later, and it has already started going back to being ground. He had never been asked to make a thing that would end. He went out and got the clay himself. The account does not say that, and I am telling you anyway, because there was nobody else in that workshop to send. He came back with it in a wooden trough, ordinary grey river clay, and set it on the bench under the good light, and the smell of it came up into a room that had never smelled like that. Wet ground, rain on stone, the bottom of a slow river. Then he measured out water and began. Working clay takes longer than people think. You wet it, and you fold it over onto itself and push it away with the heel of your hand and fold it back. And you do that for a long time before it is ready for anything. His hands knew the trade inside of 10 minutes. Hands like that always do. He started at the feet, the way you start when a piece has to stand. He built the small bones of the foot properly, every one of them, because he did everything properly, and because a foot that is only shaped like a foot will not carry weight the way a foot does. He built the ankle so it would turn. He built the knee so it would fold and lock and take a load. And he tested it wet, moving the joint under his thumb, feeling for the place where the motion stopped. He worked upward, hours of it, the long muscle of the thigh, the set of the hips, the spine laid in one piece at a time, with the spaces left open between them, the way they are open in a living back, the ribs, the cage of the chest, and then the hollow inside the cage, which he left empty, because whatever was going in there was not going to be put in by him. The hands took him the longest. Anybody who has tried to make a hand can tell you why. There are more moving parts in a hand than in most of the rest of a body, and every one of them is small, and they all have to work together, or none of it works at all. He built the palm and then the fingers separately, one at a time, and set them, and adjusted them, and set them again. He put the creases in at the knuckles. He put the fine ridges on the pads of the fingertips, the ones that let a thing be gripped, the ones that leave a mark on wet clay. He did the fingernails. Nobody was ever going to check. That is the part of this room I keep coming back to. There was no inspection coming. The order had been given by a king who wanted a result and was not going to be examining the workmanship on the little finger of the left hand. The craftsman built the nails anyway, each one bedded into the flesh of the fingertip with the pale half-moon showing at the base, because he had never, in his existence, made anything to the standard of who was looking. Then the head, and then the face. And the face is where the work slowed down. He built the skull and hollowed it. He set the sockets and did the small architecture around the eyes, the ridge above, the sweep of bone underneath. He built the nose from the bridge down, the mouth, the line of the jaw, which he adjusted 3 times. The eyelids he made last, and he made them closed. His hands would have told him what he was building before his mind got there. Hands like that always know first. This thing was going to walk into a village. That was the whole reason for the clay. A gold woman is a wonder, and a wonder gets stopped at the edge of town. Anything the sky sends down out of the sky arrives looking like it came out of the sky. And people are not stupid, and they meet a thing like that with the door shut. But this was going to be earth and water. The same earth and water they were. The same stuff as the pot on their shelf and the floor of their house and the ground their dead were in. It was going to pass. And a thing made of earth and water does what earth and water do. It gets tired. It gets cold at night. It gets hungry. And eats. and is hungry again a few hours later, which is a small daily indignity that nothing in that workshop had ever experienced. It gets sick, it gets old, and at the end of the arithmetic, sooner than anybody would believe from up there, it stops. Stand everything that room had ever produced in a line. The gates of heaven, the armor, the golden women who do not run down, all of it built to outlast the rock it sat on. And then this, the first thing in the history of that workshop that was designed, on purpose, at the specific instruction of the King of the Sky, to fall apart. At some point in the work he stopped. That is in no source, and I am putting it in anyway. And I will tell you why in a moment. He was at the bench with the figure lying in front of him. Finished, or near enough. Grey and cold and not breathing. And he stopped and stood there with his hands wet to the wrist and did not do anything for a while. Then he went back to work and finished it. Here is why I put that in. We know a few things about this god from other rooms and other days. And one of them we know for certain, because a surviving Greek tragedy records it. Later, much later, a different order came down about a different prisoner, and Hephaestus was sent to a cliff at the edge of the world to drive the pins that would hold Prometheus against the rock. He said out loud, in front of witnesses, that he did not have the heart for it, and that the work was hateful to him. He said it, and he grieved, and then he picked up the hammer and did the job perfectly, because the alternative was joining the man on the rock. That is the God who stood at this bench. So when I tell you, he paused over the clay, I am not inventing a temperament. I am reading one the record already gave us, backward, into an earlier room. The pause belongs to him. The poem does not have it. He does. What did he actually know? Standing there. He knew there was a grievance, and he knew whose it was. He had been robbed in that room, personally, by a friend, and the friend had walked out through a door he was welcome at, and strangers had come and raked over the coals in his own hearth. He knew this order came down out of that, and he knew the shape of the thing he was building, because the shape is not subtle. Nobody commissions a body out of riverbank clay unless they want it walking among people made of riverbank clay. What he did not know was what was going in the chest. That was somebody else's part of the job, and it had not arrived yet. So he finished. He smoothed the seams. He went over the whole figure with a wet cloth, closing the small imperfections. And he did that part slowly, the way you go over a piece you are done with when you are not quite ready to be done with it. And then he did the thing that turns clay into something else. The figure went to the fire. You watched this happen once already tonight, in a pottery yard on a dry hillside, where a potter set a shoulder-high jar into his kiln and raked the coals up around it and fed the heat through a day and a night. Same trade, same physics. Clay goes in soft and comes out permanent. And there is only one school where that lesson is taught. And the tuition is heat. The fire in this room was not the fire in the pottery yard. This was the source, the great banked hearth of Olympus, the one every flame on the floor of the world came down from, whether the people warming their hands at it knew that or not. Two pictures, side by side, and they are the same picture. Down on the plain, a man made a jar out of earth and water and hardened it in fire that had been stolen out of this workshop. Up here, a god made a woman out of earth and water and hardened her in the fire the theft had come from. The jar and the woman came out of the same trade, and the fire that finished both of them was the same fire. Nobody arranged that. There is no version of this story where anybody planned it. It is what you get when the answer to a theft is built out of what the theft made possible. When she was cool enough to touch, he lifted her out and stood her on the workshop floor, upright, unmoving, eyes closed, finished. Then he stepped back and washed his hands, because the door was going to open shortly, and the rest of them were coming. Athena came first, in the morning, carrying cloth over her arm. She did not arrive the way visitors arrive. She walked into that workshop the way a person walks into a job, went past the racks and the bins without looking at them, and put the cloth down on the clean end of the bench. It was her own weaving. That is in the poem, and it matters, because there was nothing that goddess made carelessly, and nothing she made that was not the best of its kind. The stuff was silver white, and it moved wrong for cloth. Too liquid, sliding off the bench edge and having to be caught. There was a veil folded on top of it, worked all over with figures, and the figures were of things that live in the sea and things that live on the land, and a person could have stood there an hour going over it and still be finding new ones. There was a crown for the head, and a band of worked gold to go round it. She dressed the figure herself. She did not hand the work to anybody. Watch how the cloth goes on, because everybody hurries past this. It goes on, the way clothes go on, a person who cannot help. Athena lifted an arm and put it through and set it down, lifted the other one, turned the head with 2 fingers under the jaw to get the neck of the garment over it. The way you turn a sleeping child's head, and the head turned exactly as far as it was moved and no farther, and stayed where it was put. She pinned the shoulder. She dropped the skirt of it and knelt and ran the hem straight along the floor with her thumb. She stood up and looked and moved one fold half an inch to the left because it was not sitting right. None of that is a ceremony. That is fitting a garment onto a mannequin. Then the veil, over the head and down. Then the crown, set and adjusted. Then the gold band. And Athena stepped back and looked at the whole of it, the way anybody looks at their own finished work. That was the cloth. That was the small part. The other thing she gave took the rest of the day and went in under the skin. And the poem gives it one line and moves on. She taught the hands the craft. Our word for it has gone soft. When the old poet says Athena taught her the work of the loom, he is not describing a hobby. He is describing most of what a household in that country actually was. A Greek house ran on wool. Nearly everything anyone in a farming village put on their body came off a loom in somebody's front room. And behind the loom stood a woman. And behind her stood the whole long chain that got the wool there. The shearing, the washing, the combing, the spinning. It did not stop, and it did not have a season where it stopped. The cloth was the clothes, and the cloth was the bedding, and the cloth was the sail on the boat, and the cloth was the thing you traded when you needed something you could not make. A household with a good weaver in it was warm and clothed and had something to sell. A household without one was not. So the craft is not a decoration on this woman. It is the reason she is going to be wanted. And it went in through the hands. Athena took the right hand off the figure's side and opened the fingers and turned the palm up and looked at it. And it was a very good hand. Every joint in it worked. The craftsman had built it to grip. There was a loom in that workshop, because Hephaestus had built himself one. She stood the figure in front of it and put the hands where hands go. Then she ran the work. That is the only way I can describe what happened over the next several hours. The figure did not learn anything, because the figure was not awake and there was nobody in there to learn. Athena moved the hands through the motions from the outside, and the motions went in and stayed. The way a groove goes into a road that gets driven the same way often enough. The shuttle across, the beat, the heddle rod lifted, the shed opened, the shuttle back the other way. Again, the turn of the wrist that keeps the edge straight, which takes an ordinary weaver a full year to stop getting wrong, and which went into these hands in an afternoon. The pinch of the fingers that judges the thread and knows when it is going thin and will break in 4 more passes. The tension, the count, hour after hour, in a room where the only sounds were the loom and the fire. A goddess stood behind a clay woman and worked her arms and put a lifetime of a trade into a pair of hands that had never held anything and did not yet belong to anybody. By the end of it, those hands were better at that work than any hands in the world below. Not good, better than anyone. There were women down on the plains who had been at a loom since they were 6 and would be at one until they died. And they could not have done what these hands could now do. And they had never done anything to deserve that, and neither had she. Then Athena took the hands off the loom and put them back down at the figure's sides, where they hung, palms toward the thighs. Unremarkable. Every part of that is a kindness. Read it back and there is nothing in it that is not a kindness. She will be skilled. She will be able to do the thing that makes a person valuable in a house. When she stands in a doorway with nothing else in the world, she will have this, and it was chosen for exactly one reason. The plan required a door to open. Every part of the design was aimed at that door, and this part was aimed at what happens after. Beauty gets a person invited in. Skill gets a person kept. A man standing in his own doorway looking at somebody he has never seen before is doing a piece of arithmetic, whether he admits it or not. And a trained hand goes into the sum on the good side and weighs more than anybody in that house would ever say out loud. She was going to be easy to take in. That was the specification. Athena built to it. Of everything that was put into that figure over those days, the loom is the only gift that had a good afternoon in it. There is going to be a house, and in that house, a room with a loom standing against the wall, and light coming across it in the middle of the afternoon, and a woman working with the shuttle going back and forth and her mind somewhere else entirely. Hours of that, years of it, the best part of most days. Those are Athena's hours. They came out of this room, off the end of an order written by a king who was not thinking about anybody's good afternoon. Aphrodite came in the evening, and she did not stay long. There is no scene in the poem. The old teller gives this visit a handful of words and keeps walking. And for once, the hurry feels honest. Because whatever happened in that room happened fast. She came down the workshop floor and stood in front of the figure and looked at it for a moment. The way you look at a piece of work. Somebody else started. Then she poured grace over the head. That is the poem's own phrase, and I am keeping it. Because it is better than anything I would come up with, and because the poem is telling you something with the verb. Not gave. Not taught. Poured. Whatever it was came down over the outside of her like water off a jug, over the crown of the head and down, and it went into the surface of the thing and stopped there. And with it, the second half, and the poem is blunt about this one. Longing that unstrings the limbs. Cruel longing. In some translations, the kind that takes the strength out of the knees of whoever is looking. Look at where that lands. It does not land in her. Read the line 10 times, and it never once lands in her. It lands in the knees of a person who is not in the room, who has not entered this story yet, who is at that moment somewhere down on the plain going about an ordinary evening with no idea that anything is being aimed at him. She was not given desire. She was given the power to cause it. There is a whole world between those two things. And the poem sits right on the line and does not blink. Then Aphrodite was finished, and she left. Others came through as the evening went on. The Graces hung gold at the throat, worked chains of it, laid on and settled. The Seasons came in with an armful of spring flowers and worked them into the crown. Live ones, the small early kind that come up out of cold ground. And when all of it was done, and the figure stood on the workshop floor, finished from the outside, dressed and crowned, and gold at the neck and flowers in the hair, everyone in that room turned and looked at her, and not one of them could look for long. A room full of immortals, beings who have seen every beautiful thing that exists because they made most of it, standing in a workshop with their eyes sliding off a made object. One would look and then find something to do with his hands. One would look and turn to say something to somebody and not finish the sentence. The craftsman had been in that room for days with the piece, and had touched every part of it and knew where every seam was. And even he came around the end of the bench and stopped, and had to take a second to remember what he had come around the bench for. Nobody said anything about it. You do not stand in a room and announce that you cannot look at something. Now put her back in that picture. She is standing on a workshop floor with her eyes closed. She is not awake. She does not know there are people in the room. She does not know there is a room. She has never seen a face, including her own. And she is not going to see her own. Not that day, and not ever. Because there is no mirror in a forge, and there is not going to be a mirror in the house she is going to. Wealthy houses in that country had bronze mirrors. A farmhouse on a plain did not. Water, maybe. A still bucket in the morning. If the light is right, and nothing has been drawn yet, that is the closest she will get. And a bucket does not show you what a room full of people see when they look up. So run the inventory on the whole day's work. Athena gave her the loom, and the loom is hers. She will use it every day of her life. She will feel the shuttle in her hand and the tension in the warp, and she will know, in her own body, that she is good at it. This one she will never once experience. She will live inside it. It will follow her into every room she ever enters, and it will change the behavior of every person she ever meets. And it will be, by a distance, the single most consequential fact about her from the outside. Every stranger will meet it before they meet her. It will be working at full strength on the man in the doorway before she has said one word to him. And she will never be able to tell how much of what happens next is her. And she will never see it. Not one time. Not for a second. They gave a great deal to that figure standing on the floor. Skill in the hands, gold at the throat, flowers in the hair, cloth off Athena's own loom. This is the one gift on the list that was not for her. It was for the person who would open the door. The last one to come was the messenger, and the poem changes when he arrives. You can hear it change. The lines about Athena are workmanlike, and the lines about Aphrodite are lush. And then Hermes walks in, and something in the old poet's voice goes flat and hard. He stops describing and starts listing. The way a man lists things, he does not want to say twice. Into her breast. He says, Hermes Pudlies, and wheedling words, and a thieving nature, a shameless mind. He says. Then he steps back from it and says plainly that this was done by the will of loud, thundering Zeus, and moves on. The placement is the design. Athena worked on the outside. Cloth, veil, crown, and then the hands. And the hands were as deep as she went. Aphrodite poured over the head, and it stayed on the surface. And the surface was the whole point of it. The chest was left empty. The craftsman built the cage of the ribs and left the space inside it hollow, because filling it was not his part of the job, and he had gone as far as his instructions took him, and stopped. Hermes filled it. Everything anybody could see of that woman was somebody else's work. What she was, in the dark, alone, with nobody looking, that was his. Now I have to slow down, because we have arrived at the ugliest thing in the source, and I am not going to walk past it, and I am not going to soften it. What the poem is doing here is old, and it is not subtle. There is a second passage a little further along where the same poet is even more direct, where he says that from this one woman comes the whole race of women, and calls them a plague to men, and goes on for a stretch about how they eat what they do not earn. The lines are there. Anybody can go read them. They have been read for 3,000 years. That was a man in a village in central Greece, writing sometime around 700 years before the Common Era, putting down what the men in his village thought. He was a farmer, with a grudge against his own brother, and a low opinion of a great many things. And this poem is where he put it. It is not a report from heaven. It is a document. The document has an author, and the author had a temper. So when I tell you what Hermes put in her chest, I am telling you what is in that document. I am not telling you what is true about anybody. And the poem is not either, whatever it thought it was doing. With that said, look at the machinery. Here is what is being described. Stripped of the poet's opinion of it, a god took an object that was not awake and installed a set of traits in it. The object did not choose them. The object was not consulted. The object could not have been consulted, because it was standing on a workshop floor with its eyes closed, and was not a person yet in any sense that would let it agree or refuse. Then, later, that object was going to be blamed for having those traits. That is the engine of this whole story, and it is sitting right there in the source, and nobody has to invent a thing to see it. The poem tells you, in order, first, that the qualities were installed from outside by somebody else, and second, that she is at fault for having them, both in the same poem, a few dozen lines apart. Every teller since has kept the second half and quietly lost the first. Ask the question the poem never asks. Whose thoughts were they going to be? She will have a mind. It is going to run all day, the way minds do. There will be a morning when she wants something she is not supposed to want, or says a thing that is not quite true because the true thing is harder, or feels a pull towards something she has been told to stay away from. That is a Tuesday. That is what having a mind is. But when it happens in that mind, where did it come from? She has no way to check. There is nothing to compare it against. She has no childhood to look back on. No years of being one way and then noticing she has become another. She arrives complete, with a fully furnished interior, and every piece of furniture in it was carried in by somebody else while she was not there. And nobody is ever going to tell her. That is the piece that finishes it. Hermes did his work in a room she was not conscious in, and then he closed her up and left. And there is not one line in any version where anybody sits her down afterward and explains what she is carrying. She will spend her whole life unable to tell the difference between herself and her instructions. Neither will we. Incidentally, so the chest was closed, and Hermes stepped back. The work was finished. Everything that was going to be put into that figure had been put into it. She stood in the middle of the workshop floor, dressed, crowned, gold at the throat, spring flowers in her hair, hands at her sides, eyes shut, fired clay, hard and cool, as complete an object as had ever been made in that room, and that room had made the gates of heaven. One thing was left, and it was the smallest item on the list, and it took less than a minute. She did not have a name. They named her for the room. That is the strange part, and it takes about a minute to see, and then it never stops being strange. She was not named for anything she was, or anything she did, or anything anybody hoped she would become. She was named for what had just happened to her in that workshop over the past few days. Everybody had given her something. That was the name, Pandora. It comes apart into two pieces. Pan, which is all, everything, the whole of a thing, and Doran, which is a gift. Put them together and you have all gifts, or every gift, or the sum of what was given, and the Greek leaves it open in a way that is going to matter later tonight. Read it one way, and it means the one who was given everything, the receiver, the end of a long line of hands that each put something in, which is exactly what happened in that workshop, and it is almost certainly what the poet meant, because he says so a few lines later in his own words. All of them gave her a gift. He says, "A sorrow to men who eat bread." Read it the other way, and it means the one who gives everything, the giver, the source, the hands things come out of, rather than the hands things are put into. Greek allows both. The grammar does not settle it. A compound like that sits there holding two meanings and waits for context to decide. And the context in this poem is a workshop and an order from a throne. So the poem decides it one way and closes the question. Two things survive from the ancient world that are worth setting down here. And then I will get out of the way. There is a cup in a museum in London, wide and shallow, the kind a man drank wine out of at a party, painted on a white ground, made about 200 years after that poem was written. There is a woman standing on it between two gods, being worked on, being finished, and painted beside her, in Greek, is a name, Anisidora. It means she who sends up gifts from below. It is the name of a power that comes up out of the ground, and it gets used in other places and other centuries for the earth herself and for a goddess of grain. That is the first thing. The second thing is a different set of pots, in different museums, and on those, the scene is not a workshop. On those, a woman is coming up out of the earth, not standing on the ground, rising out of it, with the ground open around her, arms lifted, and standing over the place where she is rising, men with hammers, striking the ground, calling her up. Different pots, different scene. Nobody in the ancient world ever wrote down for us how the woman on the cup and the woman in the poem and the woman coming out of the ground are related, or which came first, or whether the poet in his village had ever heard of any of it. The cup is there, the pots are there, the poem is there. I am going to leave that where it is. In the workshop, the naming took less than a minute. Somebody said the word out loud, or the king said it, or it went around the room, the way a decision goes around a room. The oldest account does not stage it, and I am not going to stage it either. They called her all gifts, and the giving was over, and everything was in her that was ever going to be put in her. She still had not opened her eyes. The first thing was sound, and it came before there was anybody to hear it. That is the closest I can get to it. There was a low sound, and then there was somebody. The sound was happening too. And the order of those two is wrong, but it is the order it happened in. It was the fire, the great hearth at the far end of the workshop, banked, breathing under its ash, making the noise a big fire makes when nobody is working it. A slow, settling, small ticks as things shift in the bed. Underneath all of it, a steady, low draw. The sound of a lot of air being pulled quietly through a lot of coal. Then light, through the lids, before the lids opened, orange, and moving. Then she opened her eyes, and the first thing she saw was the ceiling of the cavern, and it was a very long way up. Give her a second with that, because everybody who tells this story goes straight to the room and the gods and the plan, and nobody ever gives her the ceiling. It was rock, worked and vaulted, and it went up into a dark. The firelight did not reach the top of, and it was the first thing that ever existed as far as she was concerned. She had no word for rock. She had no word for high. She had no idea there was anything else anywhere. Then, the floor. She was standing on it. The floor was stone, and it was warm, because the forge was close, and the warmth came up through the soles of her feet. And that was the second thing that ever happened. Then wait. There was cloth on her shoulders, and it pulled a little. There was gold at her throat, and it was cool, and it moved when she moved. There was something on her head. None of that had names either. Then the room. The room was full of enormous people, and they were all looking at her. She had never seen a face, so the first faces she ever saw were arranged in a half circle in front of her at a distance of about 10 feet, and they were the faces of powers, tall as weather, bright the way the fire was bright, and every one of them was pointed directly at her, and had been for some time. She looked back at them, because there was nothing else to do. and every one of them knew what she was for. The one who built her knew. He had gone out and dug the clay himself, and he had built her feet so they would carry her a long way, and he knew where she was going and roughly what would happen when she got there. The one who dressed her knew, and had chosen the loom on purpose. The one who poured grace over her head knew who was going to be standing in the doorway when it started working. The one who filled her chest knew exactly what he had put in there and why. And he was in the room, watching her, the way a man watches a device he has finished wiring. And the one who ordered all of it knew, because he had spent whole seasons in the high air over a plane of lights, doing the arithmetic that ended in her. Every mind in that cavern held the same picture, the whole route from that floor to that door, and it was the only thing any of them was thinking about. And there were 9 or 10 of them, and there was one of her. She was the only one in the room who did not know. Nobody said anything for a moment. Whatever the plan was for this part, nobody had written it down and nobody had rehearsed. So there was a stretch of time in a workshop under a mountain where a made thing stood on the floor looking at the beings who had made her, and none of them spoke, and the fire went on, settling in the hearth. Then she said something. The account does not say what. There is no line. There is no scene. 3,000 years of tellers have gone past this moment without stopping. And the reason is that the poem does not stop either. Because to the poem, she is a delivery. And a delivery does not have a first sentence worth writing down. So we do not know the words. We know a few things about them, and that is all. We know it was short, because the first thing anybody ever says is short. We know it came out in language, fully formed, in a voice nobody had heard before, because there was a voice in her along with everything else, and it was a good one. Wheedling words, the poem says, and winning ones. It would have been clear, and it would have been pleasant to listen to, and it would have been the kind of voice a person leans slightly toward. And we know it was aimed at somebody, because a first sentence always is. She was looking at a room full of faces. She said it to one of them. Here is the only thing about that moment I am certain of, and I will say it once. Nobody in that room knew whether the sentence was hers. Not one of them. Hermes had spent an afternoon installing an interior in a body that was not awake. And now the body was awake and had said its first words. And there was no way on earth to tell where those words had come from. They might have been the thing he built. Talking. They might have been her. The two possibilities make exactly the same sound in the air. And everybody in that cavern stood there, hearing it, and none of them could separate the one from the other. She could not either. She said the first sentence of her life in a room full of people who had built her, and not one being in existence, including her, could tell whether it belonged to her. Then somebody answered her, presumably, and the moment closed the way moments do. The order came down that she was to be taken below. Hermes took her by the hand and walked her out of the workshop, and the first thing that happened was the light. The cavern mouth opened onto the flank of the mountain, and outside it was the middle of a clear day. She had been alive a few hours, and every one of them had been indoors, under a rock ceiling, in the orange of a banked forge, and she came out into open daylight the way you come out of a movie theater in the afternoon, which is badly. She stopped. She put a hand up. Whatever the mechanism of a made eye is, it took a moment to catch up. Then she looked out, and there was no wall anywhere. That never happens to any of us. We come into the world in a room, then a bigger room, then a yard, then a street, and the size of things enlarges over years at a pace a mind can absorb. She went from a workshop to the top of the world in one step. Everything below the mountain was visible at once. Distance in enormous quantity, arriving all together, with nothing in her memory to compare it against, because there was nothing in her memory at all. The god beside her had somewhere to be and started walking. The road down off that mountain is long. It was long that day, because they went on foot the whole way, which Hermes had no need to do. He could have crossed that distance in the time it takes to say it. He walked instead, at the pace of the thing he was delivering. And the walking took the rest of the day and into the night. Nobody wrote down why. Maybe an order came with the delivery. Maybe you cannot carry a person the way you carry a package. Make of it what you like. They went down through the high country first, where there is nothing but rock and cold air and a wind that comes off the summits like something thrown. She learned wind on that stretch. It was the first thing that ever pushed her. Lower down the ground began to have things growing on it, and she stopped for the first tree. That is not a flourish. It is the only sensible thing she could have done. Consider what a tree is if you have never seen one. It is enormous, and it is alive, and it is standing perfectly still. And it is covered in thousands of small, flat green pieces, and every one of them is moving slightly, on its own, in the wind. She would have had no way to sort out whether it was one thing or many thousands of things. She put her hand on the bark. Hermes waited, and then said her name, and she came along. There were animals on the middle slopes, goats on the rock above the path, watching them go by with that flat yellow eye. Goats have birds that came up out of the scrub in front of them and went away fast and low. A hawk, high up, doing nothing at all in a very complicated way. She asked questions the whole way down. I would bet everything on that. A mind that knew, moving through a world that full, with somebody walking beside it who knows the name of every single thing. She would have asked constantly, and the questions would have been the ridiculous fundamental ones, the ones with no floor under them. What is that? Why does it do that? Does it always do that? What is that noise? Is that far? And he answered her. He would have been good at it. Whatever else that God is. He is the best talker in creation. It is his entire portfolio. He is the one they send when something has to be explained, or sold, or smoothed over. And he had a full day on a mountain road with an audience of one who had no way to check anything he said against anything else. So he told her what a tree was, and what the hawk was doing up there, and why the wind comes down a gorge the way it does. All of it accurate, all of it useful. A pleasant day's conversation with a good companion. And by the bottom of the mountain she knew 100 things she had not known at the top, and every one of them was true. And in all of it he did not tell her one thing about where she was going, or what would happen when she got there, or what she had been made for. That is not lying. Nothing he said was false. He simply had a list of subjects, and the list did not include her. And he was extremely good at keeping a conversation moving through a landscape without ever arriving at the one place in it that mattered. She would not have noticed. How could she? She had nothing to compare a conversation to. She did not know that a person walking beside you for a whole day is usually the sort of person you would ask where you were going, or that not being told is a thing that can happen to you, or that it was happening. The sun went down while they were still on the lower slopes. That is when she saw them. They came out one at a time, the way they do. She saw the first when the light had gone blue and thick in the valleys, and the plain below was almost dark. A point of orange, small, far out on the flat, sitting there, steady. Then another, off to the left, then 3 more together, close, which would have been a village. Then, as the last of the light went, and the black came up properly out of the ground, more and more, scattered across the whole floor of the world in front of her. Dozens of them. Then, more than she could have counted, if she had known how to count. Strung along the dark lines that were the rivers, clustered where the rivers met. She stopped on the road and looked at them. This is the only view of it she ever got. This is the one night of her existence when she was above the world and could see the whole spread of it at once. From tomorrow on, she is at ground level, in one house, in one valley, and the world is what you can see from a doorway. Everything she will ever know about how many people there are and where they live and what shape the whole thing has. She is learning, right now, standing on a mountain road in the dark, looking down at the lights. They were beautiful. That is all it was to her. Something in the dark that was warm-colored and small and steady, spread across the whole visible earth. And she had no idea what she was looking at. She did not know that each one was a hearth. She did not know there were people around them, or that people come in families, or what a family was. She did not know the light was a fire, or what fire was, or that fire was the only reason there were people down there at all. And she did not know that those lights were the reason she existed, that every one of them had been counted, from a place not far from where she was standing, by a king who had counted them night after night and watched the number climb and gone through every answer he had until he arrived at the last one. That the whole order of her making, the clay and the water and the loom and the grace and the closed chest, came out of the fact that those small warm points would not stop appearing on that plane. She stood on the road and looked at the lights for a while because they were nice to look at. Hermes stood next to her and let her look. He knew all of it. He had known it since before she was fired. He had put part of it into her chest with his own hands. Then he said it was not much further, and they went down. The house sat at the edge of a plain, where the ground starts to lift toward the hills, and it belonged to a man named Pithos. Before there is a knock at that door, you should know who is inside it, because everybody in the last 3,000 years has come to this house with their mind already made up about him. He was a Titan, and he was the brother of Prometheus, and their names are two halves of the same word, turned in opposite directions. Prometheus is forethought, the one who thinks before. Epimetheus is afterthought, the one who thinks after. That is what the old poets built into them, and it is the whole of what most people know. Told that way, he is the fool of the story, the slow brother, the one who gets it wrong so the plot can happen. Stand in his house a minute before you agree to that. He lived in the present tense, and the present tense is not a small country. It is where everything actually is. Show his brother a spring morning and his brother sees the winter folded up inside it. Because that is what forethought does. It looks at a thing and sees the 10 things coming after it. Show Epimetheus the same morning and he sees the morning. All of it. The light on the wet ground. The smell of it. The particular blue over the hills that is only that blue for about 20 minutes. People liked him. That is the only way to explain the shape of his life. He was the brother people came and sat with. Generosity was easy for him, because generosity is only difficult if you are running the numbers on it. And he never ran the numbers on anything. If you were in front of him, you had all of him. Nothing was being held back for later, because later was not a place he lived. And he had a warning. His brother had given it to him. The exact words survive, which is unusual. And they survive because everything afterward turned on them. If Zeus sends you a gift, do not take it. Send it back, for fear it prove some harm to mortal men. One instruction, as clear as an instruction can be made, from the best mind in existence, about the one subject that mind understood better than anybody. He did not forget it. Forgetting is the lazy version, and it is not what happened. He remembered it perfectly. It was in him. Filed. The way a thing somebody tells you at breakfast is in you at noon. Present. Retrievable. And about 4 inches under the surface of whatever is happening right now, which the sender had accounted for. The whole plan came down to one man's door. And the plan had been built by somebody who knew which man, and knew how that man worked, and chose the delivery accordingly. A storm would have surfaced the warning instantly. A monster would have. Anything that arrived looking like a threat would have brought that sentence straight up out of him, and he would have shut the door. What arrived was the present tense. Perfected. The knock came in the morning. He opened the door, and there was a god on his step, which happens to a titan sometimes and is not in itself remarkable. Hermes was leaning, in the way he leans, entirely at ease, and he said something short and easy about a gift from the king of the sky. And beside him there was a woman. Now I have to be exact, because the usual telling of this scene is wrong in a way that costs the story everything. The usual telling is that he was overwhelmed, that the beauty came off her like heat off a fire and knocked the sense out of him, and he took her inside, the way a man takes anything he wants, and the warning drowned somewhere under that. The beauty was there. It was doing everything it had been built to do, and it had been built by an expert, and he was not looking straight at her for very long at a stretch. And that was the design working exactly as specified. But that is not what got him. What got him was that she was frightened. She had been alive for one day. She had come down a mountain in the dark with a god who talked the whole way and told her nothing. She had been walked up to a stranger's house at 9 in the morning and stood at the door while somebody else did the talking about her. She was on the step in cloth that was too good for that house. Gold at her throat, spring flowers wilting in her hair, and she did not know why she was there. And she was looking at him the way a person looks at somebody who might be about to explain. That is not a weapon. Nobody built that. Aphrodite did not pour it over her head, and Hermes did not seal it into her chest. It was just what was true about her that morning, and it was the only part of the whole delivery that was not designed. And it was the part that went through him like a nail. He looked at her, and he understood, in about 2 seconds, and without any words for it, that whatever was happening here was happening to her too, that she was not the giver of anything, that she had been brought, and a man who lives entirely in the present tense, standing in his own doorway, looking at somebody who has been brought. He said yes. The god was gone very quickly after that. There is no scene where Hermes lingers and no line where he says anything else. He had run the delivery down a mountain and across a plain and up to the one door in the world it had been aimed at. And the door had opened, and his part was finished, and he left. Epimetheus stood in his own house with the door shut, and the room suddenly containing a person who had not been in it that morning. The warning came up about 10 minutes later. That is the part that has been laughed at for 3,000 years, and it is not funny at all. He remembered. Of course he remembered. It rose in him the way a thing rises when the noise dies down. Complete, word for word, in his brother's voice. If Zeus sends you a gift, do not take it. And his brother was right. And being right had arrived on the usual schedule for that family, which is afterward. There was a woman standing in the middle of his front room, looking at the fire because she had never seen one indoors, or looking at the loom against the wall, or looking at him. There was nothing to send back. There was nobody to send her back to. The god was gone. The road outside was empty. Whatever this was, it was in the house now, and the only question left was what kind of man he was going to be about it. He got her a cup of water and asked her name. At the back of the house, in the storeroom, sunk into the packed earth floor where it had been set years before either of them was standing there, was a large clay jar. Nothing happened for a long time, and that is the part of her life nobody has ever told you about. The poem does not cover it. Go and look. There is the making, and there is the delivery, and then the very next thing in the text is the lid coming off, Between those two events, the oldest account leaves a gap you could drive a life through, and no teller since has bothered to walk into it. Because the gap is not dramatic, and the gap does not advance the plot. The gap is where she lived. So we are going in. And I will tell you at the top what is known and what is not. What is known is that she came to that house, that she and Epimetheus lived as husband and wife, and that they had a daughter. That is in the sources. Everything else in this chapter is the ordinary furniture of a farmhouse in that country in that century, which we know a good deal about from other kinds of evidence. And I am putting her inside it. Start with the fire, because the fire is where she started. She learned to light one badly first, which is the only way anybody learns. The hearth was a ring of flat stones set into the floor in the main room. There was a drill, a spindle of hard wood, and a board of soft wood with a shallow socket burned into it, and a bough to spin the drill with, and a nest of dry moss and shredded bark. That was the whole apparatus. Every house had one. No house could function without one. And a child could work it. She could not. She got smoke on the third day. That is fast. And it was the first thing in her life she had done entirely on her own. And she got a good curl of it coming up off the socket and leaned in and blew the way she had watched him blow. Too hard. And it went out. He did not say anything about it. He handed the board back. She got it lit a week later. Whatever a made person feels. She felt something. Kneeling on a stone floor with her palms raw and a flame standing up off a nest of moss in front of her. Then the food, which took longer and was stranger. She had not eaten before that house. There had been no reason to. And the first thing she learned about eating is not the taste. It is the schedule. You do it, and it works. And then a few hours go by and it stops working and you have to do it again. And this goes on every day and never once stops. And the whole day has to be built around it. Nothing in the workshop had prepared her for the sheer repetition of being a body. He taught her the basics in the first weeks. How to work grain into flour on the quern. Kneeling. Pushing the upper stone across the lower one, which is the sound most houses in that country made in the morning. How to bake on a hot stone at the edge of the fire. How to tell when the oil in a lamp is getting low by the change in the light, instead of by looking. She was good at all of it inside a season. Being good at things was going to be one of the constants of her life. What stopped her, that first year, was not the work. It was watching them eat. They sat down. That is what got her. There was food. And instead of dealing with it, they sat down around the fire and dealt with it slowly, and talked while they did it. And the talking had nothing to do with the food. It went on for an hour, sometimes. Somebody would tell a thing that had happened, and somebody else would say a thing back. And the fire would need feeding halfway through, and somebody would get up and feed it, and sit back down and pick up the same sentence. None of that was necessary. It cost time. Nothing about the eating required it. She watched it for a long while before she understood it was the point. Then, the loom. She came to it in the second month, maybe the third, and she stood in front of it, and her hands knew what to do. She had never woven. She had no memory of learning. Because there was no learning. Because a goddess had stood behind a clay figure in a workshop and run its arms through the motions for an afternoon until the motions were in the wood of it. So she came to the loom in that house and put her hands where hands go, and the hands went to work without her. Shuttle across. Beat it down. Lift the heddle. Open the shed. Shuttle back the other way. The wrist turn that keeps the edge straight, which takes an ordinary weaver a full year to stop getting wrong, and which she had never once gotten wrong in her life. She was better at it than anyone in that valley, better than anyone in the country. Probably. And there were women down on the plain who had been at a loom since they were 6 and would die at 1. and they could not do what she could do. She had not earned it. She knew she had not earned it. There is no way. She did not know. Because a person who has never learned a thing and can do it perfectly is aware of the strangeness every single time. She did it anyway, every day, for hours, and it became the best part of the day. The loom stood against the wall that took the even light, and the afternoon was the good time. The house quiet, the morning work behind her, the light coming through the doorway and across the floor and up onto the warp, the sound of it, which anybody who has lived with a loom will tell you is the sound of a house being all right, the clack of the beater, the small knock of the weights swinging and settling, the shuttle in her hand going one way and the other, and her hands doing the work without needing her, which meant her mind was free. Her mind was free for hours, every day, for years, and nobody has ever once wondered what she thought about. I will tell you what she thought about, because it is the one thing in this house we can work out. She thought about the mountain, not constantly, not in a way that would have shown, but she had a memory that nobody else on earth had, and it was short, and it was the beginning of her, and it did not make any sense. She had opened her eyes in a room. There were people in that room, and they were all looking at her, and none of them said what they were looking at. Somebody dressed her. Somebody put gold on her. Somebody stood behind her and moved her arms at a loom, and she does not remember it. She only knows the skill is in her hands, and she did not put it there. Then a god walked her down a mountain for a whole day, and answered every question she asked. And she asked a great many, and she has gone back over that day since and noticed something. He never once said where she came from. She would have raised it with Pithos, in the first year, in the ordinary way, the way you raise a thing over food. Something like, "Do you know why they made me?" Or, "Do you know what I was for?" And Pithos, who had a warning in him about a gift from Zeus and a woman standing in his house who was the gift, would have said something kind and slightly beside the point. That is not a lie either. He did not know the plan. Nobody had briefed him. He knew a god had come to his door, and he knew what his brother had said about gifts, and he had a suspicion he could not stand to look at directly. And when she asked him a plain question over a plain meal, he gave her the shape of an answer and moved to something else. She let it go. She was 2 months old, and every single thing was strange. And she had no way to rank one strangeness above another. But it stayed in her. That is the point of this whole chapter. A person who does not know where she came from carries the not knowing around like a stone in a pocket, and takes it out at odd hours, and looks at it, and puts it back. Then the sleeping, which was the last thing she learned, and the thing that never stopped surprising her. They lie down in the dark, all of them, at the same time, and they go unconscious on purpose for most of the night, in a house made of mud brick, on a plain where anything can come across the fields, and they do not know what tomorrow is going to be. That was the part. She asked him about it once, or something close to it, and he did not really understand the question. They did not know if the rain would come. They did not know if the grain would hold out. They did not know if somebody in the house would be well or not well in a week. They had no information about any of it. And they banked the fire and lay down in the dark and slept. She lay awake next to that more than once in the first year, trying to work out how it was done. And him. I will keep this short, because the sources keep it short. They lived in that house together for years. They ran a farm. They had a daughter. In time. And I will come back to that at the end of tonight. What is fair to say is that there was something real in it, and you can read the shape of it off. 2 facts. The first is that he had every reason to be afraid of her. He knew where she came from. He had taken a gift from Zeus against the direct instruction of the one being in existence whose advice on that subject was worth anything. And he knew it. And it sat in him. A man in that position could very easily have spent the rest of his life watching her out of the corner of his eye. The second is that she stayed and worked and built a life in that house and had a child there. That does not happen in a house where somebody is being watched. Whatever went on between those two, it went on, with the warning sitting in the room the whole time, unspoken, in a man who could not unknow it, whatever he chose to do about that daily. It seems to have come out on the side of decency. You can call that love if you want. I would say it looks like two people who got on with it. Now the jar. It was in the storeroom at the back. A small dark room off the main one, where a family in that country kept what a family keeps. Oil, grain, dried fish, saltfish in season, wine. If there was wine, it stood about shoulder height on her. Fired clay, the ordinary red-brown of every vessel in that world, and it was set into the packed earth of the floor, sunk a third of its depth, which is how big jars were kept and how you find them in the ground today. It had been sunk there before she arrived. Sinking a jar is not a casual act. It goes in once, and it stays. Whether it had a lid or a stopper is not recorded and hardly matters. There was something over the mouth, and it was not hers. She did not bring it. She had carried nothing down that mountain. She arrived at that door with the clothes on her body and nothing in her hands. And the jar was already in that storeroom, sunk in that floor, before she ever stood in the doorway. Where it came from is not stated anywhere in the oldest account. The poem simply has her take the lid off a jar in that house. Later tellers added the dowry, the gift she carried in with her, because a story is tidier that way, and because it puts the thing in her hands, where a blame story wants it. The oldest version does not, and in this telling, it is where the oldest version leaves it, already in the house, already in the floor, waiting before she got there. She walked past it every day for years. She went into that storeroom in the morning for oil, and in the evening for grain, and at the turn of the season to check what was keeping and what was not. It was there the way a beam is there. Sometimes, going past in the dark with her hands full, she would put a palm flat against the side of it, not for any reason. It was cool, and the storeroom was close and dark, and the clay was pleasant against a hand at the end of a hot day. Nothing ever happened when she did that. She asked him about the jar once, early on, and she thought about the answer for years afterward. It was in the first month, maybe the second, when she was still learning where things were kept. She came out of the storeroom with oil and said something perfectly ordinary. "What is in the big one at the back? Is it empty? Should I be putting anything in it?" And he answered her, and the answer was slightly wrong, not evasive, not a lie. He said something about it being old, and something about it having been there a long time, and something about leaving it be. 4 or 5 sentences, which is 3 more than the question needed. And then he changed the subject to the roof. That was all. If you had been in the room, you would not have noticed. She did not notice at the time either. She noticed later, the way you do, when a small oddity comes back to you on some other afternoon and you find you have kept it. She asked once more. It was years on, a winter evening, the two of them at the fire. Nothing happening. The kind of hour when people say things they have been carrying. She had been carrying 2 of them and they had grown together into one. She asked him where she came from, not where she had walked from. He knew that. She meant the other thing, the thing under it. And he understood her perfectly. And she watched him understand. She said it in the ordinary way people say enormous things, which is flatly looking at the fire and not at him. She said she had opened her eyes in a room full of people who already knew something about her. She said a god had walked her down a mountain for a day and answered every question but that one. She said the skill in her hands was not hers and she did not know who had put it there. And she said there was a jar in the back of the house that had been in the floor because said before she arrived. And she wanted to know whether the two things were connected. That is the closest she ever came. He was quiet for a while. That is the part I keep going back to. Because whatever else that man was, he was not a liar, and he was not quick. He sat there with a thing in him that he had never said out loud to anybody. A warning in his brother's voice about a gift from Zeus, and a woman across the fire from him asking, without knowing it, whether she was the gift. And he could have told her. He knew enough to be worth telling. He did not know the plan. Nobody had briefed him. But he knew the sentence his brother had said, and he knew he had broken it. And if he had said that much, she would have had something. He said he did not know, which was true, mostly, in the way that the most damaging sentences usually are. Then he said something about how it did not matter where a person came from, which is the kind of thing people say when they are trying to be kind and cannot manage accurate at the same time. And then, after a moment, he said, one more thing, and this is the only part of the exchange that had any weight in it. He said she should leave the jar alone. He did not say why. He did not say, do not open it. And she did not hear it, as a rule, because it did not come out like a rule. It came out like a man saying a thing at the end of a difficult conversation, to close the difficult conversation. She said, all right. And they sat there, and the fire went down. And that was the last time either of them ever spoke about any of it. Two things came out of that evening, and she carried both. The first is that she now knew he knew something. Not what, just that there was a shape in him she had bumped against and he had moved away from it. The second is that she stopped asking, not out of obedience, out of the ordinary calculation people make in a house they intend to keep living in, which is that some questions cost more than the answer is worth, and you can go on for years perfectly happily with a thing put away. And most people do. She saw him look at it twice after that. The first time was an autumn evening, the storeroom door standing open and the light going, and she came in from outside, and he was in the main room, sitting, not doing anything, with his body turned toward the back of the house. He was not looking at anything else. There was nothing else back there to look at. The second time was years later, and it was worse, because by then she was ready for it. She came around the corner of the house in the middle of the day, and he was standing in the storeroom doorway with a coil of rope in his hand that he had clearly gone in there to get. And he was standing still, looking at the jar, and had been for longer than a man usually stands anywhere. He heard her, and he came out with the rope, and he said something about the rope. That is what she had. One answer that was not an answer. One sentence about leaving it alone. And two silences. Now let me step out of the house, because this is where the truth and the version most people carry come apart hardest, and you should have the actual state of the evidence. The oldest surviving telling of this story does not contain a prohibition. There is no scene where Zeus forbids her to open it. There is no line where Hermes hands it over with instructions. There is no moment where anyone says, on the record, do not lift this lid. The whole familiar picture. The woman told firmly not to open it. The days of mounting temptation, the giving in, the curiosity that could not be held back. That picture is not in the oldest poem. It came in later, layer by layer, over centuries of retelling, and hardened into the version painted on the walls of every schoolroom. What the oldest poem gives us is smaller and stranger. There was a jar. She took the great lid off it with her hands. That is the sentence. That is all of it. No reason is stated. None. Not curiosity. Not defiance. Not temptation. Not the nature the messenger built into her. The poet does not offer one. And he was perfectly willing to offer opinions about her elsewhere in the same poem. At length. So the silence here is not shyness. He did not say why, because he does not seem to have thought it mattered. Every reason you have ever heard for what she did was added afterward by somebody who could not stand the blank. I am going to leave the blank where it is. So we go back into the house, and the years go by, and the jar stands in the storeroom sunk in the floor with something over the mouth of it, and she walks past it in the morning for oil and in the evening for grain, and puts her palm flat against the cool side of it sometimes on a hot day, and nothing happens until an afternoon when something did. One thing about that object first, because the picture in your head is wrong, and the wrongness has a date on it and a name attached. We will come back for the name later tonight. The Greek word in the poem is Pithos. A Pithos is not a box. It is not a chest, not a casket, not a small pretty thing with a hinge and a clasp that a woman could carry under one arm. A Pithos is the largest ceramic object a household in that world owned, and any house with anything to store had a few, and they were the most boring and most important things in the building. Picture the real item, roughly the height of a person's shoulder, sometimes taller, wide through the belly, narrowing to a mouth at the top, and the mouth is wide enough to get your arm and shoulder down inside, because you have to be able to reach the bottom when the level gets low. Walls of fired clay 2 or 3 fingers thick, empty. It takes 2 people to move. Full. It does not move at all. They were sunk into the floor. That was common practice. And there are storerooms still standing in that country where you can walk in today and see the row of them, half buried, mouths at knee height, exactly where somebody set them 3,000 years ago. You sink a jar for good reasons. Below the floor line, the ground is cooler, and cool is what oil and grain want. A jar buried 1/3 of its depth cannot be knocked over by a child or a dog or a man carrying something heavy in the dark. And once it is in, it is in. Nobody sinks a jar with the intention of relocating the jar. What went in them was oil, and oil was the money of that world. Grain, and grain was next winter. Wine, salt fish, figs, and seed corn held back from the harvest for the spring planting, which is the most carefully guarded substance a farming family ever handles, because that is not food. That is next year in a jar, which makes the Pithos the most hopeful object in a Greek house. Hold on to that, because it is going to matter by the end of tonight. A full jar in a storeroom means somebody had a good autumn and did not eat all of it. It means somebody looked at a surplus and made a decision about a season they had not reached yet. Filling a jar is an act of faith in a future you cannot see. It is a family saying, in clay, that they intend to still be here in 6 months, and they are sending food ahead to meet themselves. The jar is the container the future gets kept in. Everybody in that country understood the object the way you understand a refrigerator. So the thing standing in that storeroom was not a mystery box. It was the most ordinary heavy fixture in a farmhouse, the same as the one 2 rooms over, with the oil in it, and the one beside that with the grain. It was in that house before she was. It could not be moved. It could not be sent back. And it could not be avoided, because the storeroom is where the oil is and a person has to eat. She did not carry the trap into that house. She was walked into a house with the trap already in it. It was afternoon, and she was alone, and she had gone in there for oil. That is the whole setup, and I am not going to improve it. The oldest account gives this moment about half a line and no reason at all. And I told you I would leave the blank where it is. So here is what there is. The light was going long in the main room, that time of day when the sun has come around far enough to come in through the door at a low angle and lie across the floor in a bright stripe with dust turning in it. The fire was down to almost nothing, banked, doing what it does in the middle of the day when nobody needs it. The loom stood against the wall with work on it. She had been at it that morning. There was a hand's width of new cloth done since yesterday. He was out. The sources do not say where, and it does not matter. out in the fields, out with the animals, out at somebody else's place, gone for the afternoon, back by dark, which is where a man in that country was on most afternoons of his life. She needed oil. The storeroom was through the doorway at the back and down 2 steps, because the floor of it was cut lower than the rest of the house, which is how you keep a store cool. Dark in there always. Even at midday. She would have taken a lamp, or she would not have bothered, depending on how well she knew the room. And she knew. That room the way you know, a room you have gone into twice a day for years, which is completely in the dark, without thinking. The oil jar was the second one on the left. Every house has an order to its store, and the order does not change. She filled what she came in with, and then she was standing in a dark room with her hands full and nowhere in particular to be for the next few hours. And the big jar was at the back where the big jar had been for as long as she had been in that house, and for years before that. She put her hand on the lid. That happened. Not for a reason. She had put her hand on that jar 100 times. On the shoulder of it. On the cool side of it. Going past on a hot afternoon. And this time her hand went to the top instead of the side. And that is the only thing that was different about that day. The lid was a slab of fired clay. Heavy. Sitting in the mouth of the jar with its own weight holding it. The way a lid like that sits. Because nothing in that world was sealed unless it needed to be sealed. It moved. It moved because that is what a lid does when a hand is on it. There was no resistance in it and no warning. No heat in the clay. No sound from inside. None of the things that would give a person the 2 seconds they would need. It shifted an inch, and the sound it made was fired clay, sliding on fired clay, which is a low grinding note, and it is a sound she had heard 1,000 times in that house from a dozen other jars. Then she lifted it clear and set it down, and nothing happened. Let that sit there as long as you can stand it, because it is the truest thing in this entire story, and nobody ever tells it. Nothing happened. Not immediately. She stood in a dark storeroom with a lid in her hands and looked into the mouth of a jar. And there was no light, and no rush, and no scream, and no wind. There was a dark room, and an open jar, and a woman holding a piece of clay. And for one ordinary breath, and then another one. Everything in the world was exactly as it had been. That is how it actually goes. Whatever the worst afternoon of your life turned out to be, there was a moment in it where you had already done the thing and did not yet know, and you were standing somewhere with your hands full, and the light was coming in the way. It had been coming in all day. Then the room changed. Cold first, and it came the wrong way. There was a draft in that storeroom. There had always been a draft. From under the outside door, at the back, and it went one direction across that floor and had gone that direction for years. And she knew it the way. You know the drafts in your own house. Something went past her ankles in the other direction, cold and moving, and heading for the doorway she had come in through. She looked down, because anybody looks down, and there was nothing on the floor to see. The floor was packed earth, and it was dark, and there was nothing there. Then more of it. Not a rush. There is no rush anywhere in the old account, and there was none in that room. It was more like a room emptying, like the way a crowd goes out of a doorway. Steadily, one after another, for longer than you would expect a room to hold that many people. Movement at the edge of her sight. She turned her head and it was not there. She turned back and something else was going past the other way. Nothing had a shape. She could not have described one of them to anybody, then or ever. And neither can I, because there is nothing in the source to describe. They had no voices. That is in the poem. It is one of the quietly horrible lines in the whole of Greek literature, and almost nobody notices it. The old poet says, The sorrows wander the earth in silence. Because Zeus took away their voices. Whatever went past her in that storeroom went past without a sound, which means the loudest thing in that room, the whole time, was her own breathing. And then it reached her. Something that came out of that jar went through her on its way past, or touched her, or simply was in the room with her long enough. And her body did a thing it had never done. It hurt. Not a wound. Nobody cut her, and nothing struck her. It was the other thing. The thing everybody knows, and nobody can explain to a body that has not had it. A tightening somewhere under the ribs. A sense of the inside of herself becoming an object with a condition. She had been alive for years in that house, and she had been tired, and she had been cold, and she had had a hard day's work in her shoulders. And none of that was this. This was her body informing her, for the first time, that it could be damaged, and that it was going to be, and that this was now part of the arrangement. She got the lid. She was fast. Whatever else is true about that afternoon. She was fast, and every version of the story agrees on it, and it has never once been counted in her favor by anybody. She had the slab up off the floor and back over the mouth of that jar, and she put her weight down on it. Fired clay came down on fired clay, and made the same low grinding note it had made going the other way, which is the detail in this chapter I find hardest to sit with. Those were Athena's hands, built, joint by joint, by the best craftsman in the universe, then trained through an afternoon at a loom by a goddess until they were better than any hands on earth. They lifted the lid. Then they put it back, not fast enough, and she stood in the dark with both palms flat on the clay, and the pressure of her whole body going down through her arms into a jar that did not need holding down anymore, because whatever was going out had already gone out through a doorway, and across a room, and under a door, and into the open air, over a plain, with 400 houses on it. Outside. It was still afternoon. She came out of that storeroom eventually. She had to, and the main room was exactly as she had left it, with the light coming in low through the door and lying across the floor in a bright stripe with the dust turning in it, and the loom against the wall with a hand's width of new cloth on it from that morning, and the fire banked and doing nothing. There was still a good part of the day left. There was oil to put away. He would be back by dark. The world had about 4 hours left of being the way it had always been, and she was the only person on it who knew. They went out across the plain that evening, and nobody saw anything. That is the design, and it is the coldest thing in the story. The old poet says it in one line and walks straight past it. The sorrows go about among men in silence, because Zeus took away their voices. Think about that as a piece of engineering. Every other punishment in this body of myth announces itself. Lightning arrives with a sound. Water comes up over the threshold where you can watch it. A monster on the road can be seen coming and, given enough generations and enough sharpened wood, killed. These were built mute. They arrive the way a temperature drops. So here is that evening, and the evenings after it, in 6 houses. The first is 9 miles east. A farmhouse on the flat. A man wakes in the dark coughing. It is nothing. It is a cough. He has had 100 of them in his life. From smoke, from dust, from a cold morning. He turns over and gets his breath back and goes down again. His wife wakes at the sound and lies there listening until it stops, then sleeps, because there is no reason on earth to lie awake over a man coughing once in the night. In the morning he is up before her and out at the wall. That is the whole scene. Nothing happens. Nothing happens for 6 days. And then something does. And the point of putting you in that room is that there was no moment where anybody could have known. The first knock is always at a door that is already open. Second house, at the top of the plain, in the spring, and the ground has gone hard. Not stony, not different to look at. The man works his line and stops and leans on the handle. And that stretch took him longer than it took last year, and he cannot say why. His father worked this field. His father's father worked this field. Same dirt, same tool, same season. And the man is not older than he was last spring by any amount that should show. The work is heavier, and there is nothing to point at. He goes on. The row gets done. It takes until dark, instead of until the middle of the afternoon. And there is a second row tomorrow, and a third the day after. And the rest of his life is going to be like this, and he will never once get an explanation. Third house, and this one is the shortest. A man comes out of his door in the morning and looks across at his neighbor's place, and counts the goats. He has looked at that field every morning of his adult life. It has always just been the field next door. This morning he counts, and the number is higher than his number. And something happens in his chest that has never happened there before. It is not anger. He would not be able to name it. He goes back inside and eats and says nothing about it to anyone. And by the following week, he is doing the counting, without noticing that he is doing it. Fourth house. A family starts tying the door at night. There is no incident. Nothing came. But at some point in the weeks after that afternoon, the man of that house, going around before bed the way he has always gone around before bed, passes a coil of cord on a hook, and stops, and takes it down, and puts a couple of turns around the doorpost. His wife watches him do it. Neither of them says anything about it. Then, or later, he does it again the next night. It becomes what the house does. 30 feet outside that door is the tree line, and it has always been 30 feet outside that door. Fifth house, and this is the one I would take out if I could. A woman lying awake, listening to her child breathe. The child is fine. That is the point. The child is asleep across the room, breathing the way children breathe. And there is no fever and no cough and nothing wrong with any part of it. And the mother lies in the dark listening anyway, because there is now a thing that can happen. She does not know its name. Nobody has told her about it, and nobody will. She just knows, the way she knows the roof is over her, that a child can be well in the evening and not well later. And once that has entered a house, it does not leave. And she is going to lie there listening on a great many nights when there is nothing at all to hear. And the sixth is not a house. It is all of them. Because in every one of those buildings, that night, the fire was burning. Every hearth on that plain, every ring of flat stones with a good bed of coals banked under ash, and the light of it going out through the doorways. And out at the tree line, the eyes that had learned an age ago that the bright circle is not theirs. The fire was doing everything it had ever done. It was keeping the cold out and the animals off. It had cooked what they ate and hardened the jars they kept it in. And it had bought them the evening hours where somebody hums and somebody mends and somebody tells a story. And none of that stopped. Not one bit of it stopped. Every gain that fire ever made for them. They still had, that night and every night after. And a man in that house was coughing. And the field had gotten heavier. And the woman was awake, listening to her child. It came in under the door and went past the fire. And the fire could not do anything about it. Because the fire was never built to. Fire holds a line 30 feet outside your house. Whatever came out of that jar was already inside. Somebody stole that fire off a mountain and paid for it in a way that is a different night's story. And it was the best thing anybody ever did for those creatures. And it is still burning in your building right now. It was not enough. That is all. It was never going to be enough. And nobody knew that until an afternoon in a storeroom. And by then the arrangement was permanent. Back in the house, at the edge of the plain, he came in, at dark. I do not know what she told him. Nobody does. There is not one word about that conversation in any source, in any century. and I have thought about it more than is probably good for me. And I am not going to put words in her mouth at this hour. What is on record is only this. Whatever was said in that room that night, they were both still living in that house afterward. One thing did not get out. She did not know that on the day. Nobody could have. There is no way to look into a jar in a dark room and take an inventory of what has left and what has not. She found out the way you find out anything about that jar, which is, slowly, over a long time, without ever being certain. The poem says it plainly, and the poem is the only witness we have. Only hope remained inside, under the rim of the jar, and did not fly out. Before that could happen, she put the lid back on. By the will of Zeus. Elpis is the Greek word. We translate it as hope, and that is fine as far as it goes. But the Greek is wider than ours. Elpis is expectation. It is whatever you carry about what has not happened yet. And it can be good, and it can be terrible. A man expecting a harvest and a man expecting a death are both, in Greek, doing elpis. So the thing under that rim is not necessarily a comfort. It is the human relationship to tomorrow, held in a jar, in a storeroom, in the dark. People have been standing around that jar arguing for 3,000 years. And there are two ways to read it, and both are honest. Read the jar as a prison, and what happened is a cruelty. Everything that could hurt them got out and ran loose across the world. And the one good thing was kept back, sealed away under a lid where they could not reach it. So the creatures below would live out their days with all of the sorrows and none of the consolation. On that reading, the last act of the punishment was withholding the only thing that would have made it bearable. Read the jar as what a jar actually is, and it comes out the other way around. A Pithos is a pantry. That is its entire function. It is where a family keeps what it lives on, sunk in the floor at the back of the house, holding the oil and the grain and the seed corn against a season that has not arrived. Put hope in that jar and it is not a prisoner. It is stores. It was in the one container in the world built to keep a thing safe. The sorrows were all outside, loose in the air, going into every house on the plain in silence, and hope was under the lid, in the dark, cool, kept, where none of them could get at it, held back for the people who were going to need it, in the exact vessel their whole civilization used for holding back what would be needed later. The same clay object, the same lid, both readings, sitting in the same line of the same poem since the first time anybody sang it. The poet does not choose. He gives the fact and moves on within 2 lines. And every teller since has picked a side and told you that side was obvious. I am going to leave the lid where it is. And there is one more thing about those jars that I have been holding back until now, because it belongs here and it does not belong anywhere else. They buried people in them. Not everybody and not everywhere, but for long stretches of Greek history, in a great many places. When somebody died, they were folded up small and put into a large storage jar, and the jar went into the ground. Infants, especially, but adults too. Archaeologists have been lifting them out of Greek soil for well over a century. The dead in the same vessel as the grain, same shape, same clay, sometimes the same workshop. So a Pithos is where you keep what you are saving, and a Pithos is where you put what you have lost. The identical object does both jobs, and everybody in that world knew both meanings without having to think about it. The way you know what a doorway is, and there is a festival, and then I will stop. In Athens, every year in the early spring, there was a 3-day festival of the new wine called the Anthesteria. The first day of it had a name, Pithorgia. It means the opening of the jars. That was the day. That was what the day was for. All winter the new wine had been sitting sealed in the Pithoi, and on that morning the city broke the seals and opened them and tasted what the year had made. And it was also, by long tradition, the day the dead came back, not as a figure of speech. The Athenians held that during those 3 days the dead were up and moving around the city, out in the streets, in the houses. People smeared pitch on their doorframes and chewed buckthorn against them. Temples were roped off. At the end of the festival there was a formal announcement, called out, telling the dead that the days were over and they could go now. The same 3 days. Open the jars, and the dead are in the street. Nobody in Athens ever wrote down that those two facts had anything to do with each other. They simply fell on the same morning. Every year, for centuries, in the city that produced most of what we know about that world. Open a jar in that country, and you were opening something that goes both ways. It always went both ways. It was never only a pantry. She sat down next to it. Not that afternoon. Some other day. Later, when the house was empty and the work was done, and she had gone into the storeroom for something ordinary. She sat down on the packed earth floor with her back against the cool side of it and stayed there a while. The house was quiet. Out beyond the door the plane was doing what it did now, which was the same as before, in every way that could be seen, and different in every way that could not. Somewhere out there a field was heavier than it used to be. Somewhere a man was coughing. Somewhere a woman was lying awake, listening to a child who was perfectly well. And there was something left in the jar behind her head, and she had no idea what it was, or whether keeping it in there had been a kindness, or the last part of the cruelty. Nobody ever told her. She sat there until it got dark. She had another 40 years, or 20, or 60. Nobody wrote it down. That is where the record stops. The lid goes back on. The poet says the will of Zeus was in it. And then he is gone. 2 lines later he is talking about something else entirely. And this woman, who he built up over 100 lines with every god in the sky contributing to her, walks out of the poem and is never mentioned again. So, this chapter is about a silence. And I am going to handle it the way I have handled every silence tonight, which is to tell you exactly where it starts and not fill it in. The poems do not tell us whether Epimetheus blamed her that night. They do not tell us whether he blamed her the following winter, or 10 years on, when the field was heavier and the work was harder, and there was a reason available for it that had a name and lived in his house. They do not tell us whether he ever said his brother's name out loud in that room. They do not tell us whether she went into that storeroom again, or whether she stopped going, or whether somebody else in that household quietly took over fetching the oil without a word ever being said about why. They do not tell us whether she touched the jar again. They do not tell us how she died, or when, or where she was put. And given what we know about that country and its jars, that last one is a question I would rather not follow all the way down. Here is what we do have, and it is not nothing. They stayed, both of them, in that house, for years afterward, and they had a daughter, and that daughter grew up in that house. And I will come to her in a moment, because she is the last thing tonight. A daughter takes years. A daughter takes a household that goes on functioning. Somebody baked bread every morning of those years, and somebody worked that loom, and somebody put oil in a lamp every evening at dusk. And the 2 people doing it were a woman who had opened a jar and a man who had opened a door. Neither of them could undo their afternoon. They lived in the house anyway. Now the other thing that happened in those years, and it happened outside the house, and she almost certainly knew. The story started, not the story we have, something rougher and earlier and shorter, moving from village to village, the way anything moves through farming country, one field to the next, at a wedding, at a funeral, at the well, There was a jar. There was a woman. She opened it. And now, this is how things are. It would have taken a season to reach the far side of the plain, and a generation to reach the sea. And it would have gotten shorter the whole way. Because that is what happens to a story on the road. Stories shed. Every teller drops the parts that slow it down. And what is left is what a person can hold in one breath. Watch what got dropped. The counting went first. Nobody carried the part about a king standing at the edge of the high air over a dark plain. Night after night, watching the lights come back and running the arithmetic. That is slow, and it is far away, and it belongs to somebody who is not in the room. The workshop went next. A forge under a mountain. A god who had to read the order twice. A body built up out of river clay from the feet. The fingernails done properly on a piece nobody was ever going to inspect. Gone. Too long. Not the good part. The gifts went. One at a time. The loom. And the afternoon it took to put a lifetime of a trade into a pair of hands that were not awake. The cloth. The grace poured over the head that she herself would never once see. All of it out. Then, the chest. That one went early, I think, and it went fast. Because a story with that in it is a very difficult story to tell about somebody you want to blame. A god opened her and put lies and a shameless mind inside her before she had ever drawn breath. That is in the oldest poem, in writing. And it is the single most important fact about her. And it is the first thing any teller would find themselves leaving out. The jar itself went last, and went strangest. A Pithos sunk in a storeroom floor, already in the house before she got there, is a heavy fact to carry. Somewhere along the line the jar stopped being part of the building and became a thing she had, then a thing she was given, then a thing she brought with her. What is left after all that shedding, at the end of the road, generations later, is two objects and a verb. A woman, a lid. She lifted it. That is the version that made it. That is the version that reached the poet in his village in central Greece, who had a grudge and a low opinion of a great many things. And he wrote it down. And writing a thing down stops it moving. And she was alive while it was forming. She did not die and then get talked about. The talking started while she was still going into that storeroom for oil. It came up the road from the villages and past the door of the house it was about. Somebody would have said it to her face eventually, or said it to Epimetheus in a market, not knowing. Or a child from another farm said something in her hearing that a child had picked up at home, the way children do. And then the mother was very quiet on the way back. She had no version to put against it. Think about what she actually knew. She knew she woke up in a workshop. She knew people gave her things while she was not conscious. She knew a god walked her down a mountain and answered everything except the one question that mattered. And she did not know it was the one question that mattered until years later. She knew there had been a jar in the house before she was. She knew she had asked her husband once, on a winter evening, and had watched him decide not to tell her. She could not have told you about the theft of fire. She could not have told you there had been a grievance, or a trick with an ox on a plain called Mekone, or that a king had counted lights, or that any of it had anything to do with her. Nobody ever explained the plan to the last part of the plan, so she could not defend herself, because she did not have the information required, and she never got it. She lived in the house, and the story got bigger outside it, and she wove. And the daughter grew up. Then everybody who had been in that house died, and the story kept going, and it went on shedding for another 2,000 years. Which brings me to a man in a study in Northern Europe with a Latin dictionary. And this is the last thing I owe you about that jar. In 1508, a Dutch scholar named Erasmus, one of the great minds of his century, was assembling a collection of proverbs and sayings out of the ancient world, in Latin, for an educated European readership. He came to this story. He needed to render the Greek Pithos into Latin, and he wrote Pyxis. A pyxis is a small box, a little lidded container, the kind you keep jewelry in, or cosmetics, or ointment, something you could hold in two hands. Nobody knows exactly why he did it. He may have confused Pithos with the Greek word pyxis, which existed and meant exactly that small box. He may have been working fast, which he usually was. He may have been thinking of a different story, because there is an old tale about a woman named Psyche and a box, and the two have a family resemblance if you are moving quickly. It does not matter. One word, in one book, in 1508, and it took. That book was read everywhere by everybody who read anything, and the painters read it, and the painters started painting a small pretty box, and the poets read the painters, and 500 years later every person alive says Pandora's box, and not 1 in 1,000 has ever heard the word jar in connection with this story. Look at what the mistake did to her, because it did not only change a prop. A box is a personal item. A box is something you own, something you carry, something that is yours. A box sits on a table at the height of your hands and can be opened idly, in passing, by somebody being nosy. A box makes the whole thing a story about a woman and her possession and her curiosity about her own belongings. A jar sunk in a storeroom floor is a piece of the building. So the shedding finished its work. It took 2,000 years longer than the first round, and it was done by a scholar instead of a farmer, and the effect was the same. One more heavy fact lifted off her. One more piece of the house transferred into her hands. Every version of this story has been getting lighter for 3,000 years. Every single thing that came off it was a thing that made her less to blame. The girl's name was Pyrrha. She grew up in that house, on that plain, with a loom against the wall and a storeroom at the back that everybody in the family walked past twice a day. She would have learned to weave from the best weaver in the world, because that is what happens in a house with a loom in it. Whether anybody ever told her what her mother was, the sources do not say. Whether she found out from a child at another farm, the sources do not say. She was born after it. The world she grew up in was the world with the sorrows already in it, and she had no memory of the other one, and it would have been the only world she knew. She married Deucalion, and here is where the shape of tonight arrives. So slow down for it. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus. Look at what that marriage is. The son of the brother who thinks before, married to the daughter of the brother who thinks after. Forethoughts boy and afterthoughts girl. The line that stole the fire and the line that opened the jar. Standing up together in one house. Everything that has happened to human beings since came out of that wedding, but it comes out through water. So we have to go through the water. In a later cycle of stories, Zeus resolved to be done with the generation of men then living. That is how the tradition frames it. And I want to be careful with the seam, because it would be easy to make this the next move in a plan, and the sources do not say that. Nobody in the ancient world wrote that the flood came because the jar had failed. It is a separate story, told by later hands, about a king who looked at a generation of humankind and decided to end it. He sent rain. The first day everybody was glad, because the cisterns were low and it is a dry country. The second day it came harder. By the third the rivers were up over their banks and the low fields were gone. And there is a moment in bad weather when it stops being weather, when the sky settles into its work with a steadiness that has intention in it. And every person on that plain reached that moment somewhere around the fourth day. Prometheus told his son what was coming. The old accounts give it in a line. He told him what to build, and Deucalion built it. And it was not an ark. Your mind has already reached for the wrong picture. There is no great ship in the Greek version. No decks. No animals. 2 by 2. The word is larnax, and it means a chest. A stout wooden box of the kind a household keeps its stores in. Built, large, corked, provisioned. 2 people in a wooden box. They were in it 9 days and 9 nights, while the water took everything. Every hearth on every plain went out, one at a time, as it came up over the thresholds. All the jars in all the storerooms, the oil and the grain and the seed corn, the whole banked future of 1,000 villages, went over and rolled away in the brown dark. Then the rain stopped, and the water drew down, and on the 9th day the chest grounded on high rock, Parnassus. The old tellers say, the great mountain above what would one day be Delphi. The lid came up, and 2 faces looked out at a world with nothing on it. Mud, and standing water going grey to every horizon, and a silence with nobody in it. No smoke anywhere, no dog barking at any distance. They were old by then, both of them, past the age where a people gets rebuilt the ordinary way, and they stood on that rock and understood it. They prayed, and they got an answer, and it is one of the strangest sentences in all the old stories. Cover your heads, and throw the bones of your mother behind you. Now watch Pyrrha, because this is her scene, and it has never once been given to her. Ovid records that she refused. She wept, he says, and would not do it. And, for 2,000 years that has been read as squeamishness, the wife being upset while the husband thinks it through. A small, soft moment before the clever part. Read it again with everything you have heard tonight in your hands. The bones of your mother. Her mother was Pandora. Her mother was the woman standing at the far end of a story that had already spread across that whole country before the water came. The woman, every village on that plain had a version of by then. The woman blamed for the sorrows. That was her mother, and she had grown up in her mother's house, and she had learned to weave at her mother's loom, and now she is standing on a mountain over a drowned world, one of 2 people left alive, and a voice out of heaven tells her to dig up her mother's bones and throw them over her shoulder into the mud. She said no. Of course she said no. There is not a person alive who would not have said no. That is not a woman being delicate. That is a daughter. Deucalion worked it out. He was his father's son, and he did what his father did with rivers, which is to look at a thing for what stands behind it. Our mother. Whose mother is everybody's mother? The earth is the mother of every mortal thing that has ever walked on it, and the bones of the earth are stones. So they did it. 2 old people alone on a mountain over a drowned world, and they covered their heads, and they bent down in the mud and picked up stones, and they walked forward, throwing them back over their shoulders without looking, and behind them the stones went soft. The old tellers describe it with wonder they do not bother to hide. Each stone lost its hardness and began to swell and take shape. The way clay takes shape under a hand you cannot see. Rough at first, blurred, like figures, half-finished in a workshop, and then less rough, and then finished, and then breathing. The stones Deucalion threw stood up as men. The stones Pyrrha threw stood up as women. I am going to set 2 facts side by side now and then stop talking, because they have been sitting in the same books for 3,000 years, a few pages apart, and nobody has ever put them next to each other. Pandora is the woman remembered for letting suffering into the world, and in that same body of stories, Pandora had a daughter, and the human race that came after the water rose out of the mud behind that daughter's hands. Go back to the pottery yard. It is a different morning, a long way from everything you have just heard, and the yard is the same yard. Dry hillside, the hills going brown behind it, a low wall and a kiln, and a bench and clay drying on boards in the sun. There is a potter working, not the same man. That one has been gone a long while, and the years in between are the sort that do not get counted. And somewhere in the middle of them, a great deal of water came and went, and nobody in this yard remembers it, because nobody in this yard was there. But the trade is the trade. He is building a jar in coils, walking around it as it grows, laying one wet rope of clay on the last and closing the seam with the heel of his hand. Grey clay, cold, smelling like a river bank. By the middle of the morning it stands as high as his shoulder, near the rim, where he steadied it. His thumb has left a small dent in the wet clay. He leaves it. Fired clay keeps whatever touched it while it was soft. And 3,000 years from now, in a museum in a country that does not exist yet, people will walk past a jar behind glass and see a thumbprint on the rim and not think anything of it at all. Then it goes into the kiln, and the fire that hardens it is the same fire. It came down hearth to hearth, qual to qual, house to house, through every generation between that first doorway and this morning. And nobody in the line ever knew where it started. And every one of them kept it going anyway. Somebody got up in the night to feed it. Somebody carried it in a clay pot to the next valley. Somebody put their body between it and the wind. The fire in the kiln this morning came down from one ember, carried off a mountain in the pith of a fennel stalk by somebody who knew exactly what it was going to cost him. And what it is doing, right now, in this yard, is making another jar. There is no lesson in that. It is what happened. A man stole heat for a species that had nothing, and the species used it to harden clay, and the clay became the jars. One of those jars went into a storeroom floor in a house at the edge of a plain, and a woman, who had been made out of the same two materials, in a workshop, by hands following an order, lifted the lid. The fire made her too. Same forge, same source, earth and water, hardened in heat that had been carried out of the very room where the punishment was ordered. Nobody planned that part. Nobody could have. It is what you get when the answer to a theft is built out of what the theft made possible. So here is where all of it ends up. The fire is still burning, in the kiln, on the hearths, out across a plain that had been black once and has not been black since. The jar is closed. It went back down under her hands in a dark storeroom on an ordinary afternoon, and it has stayed closed ever since. The sorrows found the road into every human house, and they found it in silence, and they never left. And the fire that holds the dark off at 30 feet was never built to touch them. And under the rim, protected or imprisoned, kept for us or kept from us, with the argument still running after 3,000 years and no verdict anywhere in sight. Hope is still in there. That is the whole of it. She was made in a room she did not choose, out of dirt and water, by hands that were following an order. Everything she was, somebody put in. Everything she knew, somebody else decided what to tell her. She was walked down a mountain by a god who talked all day and answered nothing, and delivered to a house with the trap already sunk in the floor. She asked once, on a winter evening, in the plainest way a person can ask. She was told he did not know. She lived there. She wove. She learned to make bread on a hot stone, and she learned to sleep in the dark without knowing what tomorrow held, which is the hardest thing those creatures do, and the thing she admired most about them. And she opened a jar, one afternoon, for no reason anybody ever wrote down. 3,000 years of people have known her name and meant one thing by it. You know the rest of it now. There is a jar somewhere in your building. Not that jar. Just a container with something in it that you put by for later. A bag of rice at the back of a cupboard. Seeds in a drawer in the garage. Money You are not touching. Something set aside for a month you have not reached yet. You put it there without evidence. Nobody promised you the month. That is the oldest thing your species does. And it was already old when a woman on a plane in Greece walked past a jar in a dark storeroom twice a day for years, and put her palm flat against the cool side of it on hot afternoons. The fire is banked. The house is quiet. Everything that was going to get out got out a long time ago, and everybody has been living with it ever since. And they have gone on filling jars anyway. Rest now. It is well past the hour. Good night.